Buonasera. L'intelligenza artificiale è intelligente come pensa di essere. No? No italiano? Inglese? Okay. Inglese. Is artificial intelligence as intelligent as it thinks it is? So why start a talk in Italian? You've had a long week. And it helps get your attention even when you're eating dinner. But more importantly, it emphasizes that we make assumptions and base predictions on them, and we aren't always accurate. Most people expect a talk at ATPESC to be in English. It is highly likely it will be in English, but it is not certain, as we've seen tonight. I bring this up because this is the basis of our talk tonight. It helps us consider how human beings make decisions and how we get machines to make decisions for us. Now, I'm going to add that because it's near the end of the sessions and because it's summer and some of you are hoping to have some kind of summer vacation, I'm going to break things up a little with our talk tonight, and we're going to see some pretty pictures. These pictures have nothing to do with the talk, in most cases, but I found that people like them, and I like them, so that's why they're there. So, my background is economics, and why would you have an economist come and talk to you? I'm trained in economics and finance. So what can I possibly say about artificial intelligence that would be useful to technical experts like you? I'm trained in social science, but social science shares scientific method with all natural sciences too. But we're more inclined to ask questions like how human beings think and act. And we question those impacts on the models we create, like AI. So, we also think about the fundamentals and the methods and the foundations that are the strengths and weaknesses of everything that we do as part of our inquiries. So our goals tonight. The opening question about AI's intelligence is a useful way for us to focus on qualities used to formulate AI. How well do humans and our models predict? Can AI algorithms do better, and do they have potential shortcomings? But first, I should say what we'll mean by AI tonight, because there are a lot of different definitions. And tonight, I'm just going to make it pretty simple and just try and gear it towards machine abilities to analyze data and make predictions, maybe decisions, with a focus toward the underlying algorithms. So we have the big picture talk. We're looking up. And our starting point will be to consider briefly how humans analyze data and make decisions. How logical and rational are we? Do machines do better than we do? So human theories, analyses, and decisions draw upon beliefs, assumptions, and historic data to attempt to predict the future. This is what we do. In many instances, people analyze well and outcomes are pretty good. But in some situations, we use what are called heuristics, which are simple time-saving rules, that can lead to poor results. And some of the methods that humans like us use, like heuristics, are prone to our human biases. Now, in this sense, I don't mean bias in any way that has a bad connotation to it. It just means incongruities. You can think of statistical bias. And it turns out that many of these biases can be predicted. And this is, it turns out, a pretty hot area in economics right now. So hot, because we've borrowed from psychology and behavioral science, that this area was where the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded this last fall in 2017 to Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago. So there's a lot of interest in this now on the part of economists, and there are some things I think that we can learn for just looking at science in general. So it's hoped that by thinking about humans decide, we can look at predictable human biases, and we may understand their impact on the underlying frameworks of the models we create. So I'll start with a simple test. We look at this picture. Which table is longer and which is wider? It turns out most people choose the first table is longer and the second is wider. It turns out, though, that both are the same size. And many people are certain that they differ. In fact, I showed this in front of a group about a year ago in a talk I was giving, and one person in the audience absolutely insisted that they were different. They were not the same size. So we stopped the talk, and fortunately the screen was not this high up. We actually took a device and measured it. And that's how we can avoid the bias, by measuring. And we can automate that measuring process too. Those lines are the same size. I just flipped it. And it shows that they are the same size, because I didn't know if we would be able to actually measure it when we came here. So there are many instances where humans can be fooled, but unbiased algorithms cannot. The following shows another case where people are often fooled. And this is one that's kind of a hot button for me, and I use in class a lot. Here we see two graphs. They look pretty different. But it turns out this is the same data, but it's different scales. Now, to our eyes, these look very different. But we can use algorithms that would help us with this. So, we know that we have biases. The next question that I have then is, given our biases, how good are human forecasts? Well, it turns out experts predict worse than simple models. It's been tested. Experts are overconfident, they're inconsistent, and they actually expect there to be more exceptions to the rules that they want to apply than are observed. We call this overconfidence bias on the part of experts. It also turns out that experts are not good at revising forecasts in light of changing data. We call this status quo bias. This happens to be a big problem in project management. If you think about it, projects start, things change, circumstances change. How often is the project changed? Not that often. So I have some more evidence for you. So a guy, Phil Tetlock from Penn, interviewed 284 political and economic experts, a total of 80,000, around 80,000 predictions. So their job was to take 3 different possible scenarios and predict what they thought the probabilities were going to be for these. They performed worse than if equal probabilities were assigned for each, just arbitrarily. And most experts had great difficulty admitting error. Most interesting to me was that the most famous experts were more overconfident and they were less accurate with their predictions. So, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us more about our biases. Now, it also turns out that if we take models that are based on experts' rules, they predict better than most of the experts upon who they're based. Why is that? Well, the algorithms are consistent. We aren't. They adapt better to incremental changes in the data. They don't have status quo bias. And they reflect collective judgments of the best predicting experts. So these models actually do better. Now, the way they do this is they start by getting, they average probabilistic thinking by the experts in the algorithms to get the best results. So the algorithms in these cases that we're talking about do not supply the probabilities. Those are supplied by the experts. And it's an average of the experts, and that's what provides the best results. We've seen this in economics with predictions of what the economy will do. They take averages of what will happen in the economy, and the averages actually predict better than individual experts on average. But that raises a different question that I won't answer, because I'm good at asking questions I can't answer. How might AI derive probabilities for instances where there is limited or no data? So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something I know a little bit about, the area of finance. And I'll talk about some of our decisions there and give you some data. So how good are our investment decisions? You might care about this. Well, it turns out most people have pretty poor performance. Most investment returns are worse than the market. And what I mean by the market is that's an average of how stocks, or what we call equities, do. Why is that? We're overly optimistic. And we have emotions that enter in, like fear and greed, which drive markets, and they lower our overall results. So this has been tested too, as you might imagine. And so a guy, Terry Odian at Berkeley, did this test. He looked at about 10,000 individual brokerage accounts and approximately 163,000 trades. So a lot of data. So on average, after trading costs, shares sold did better than those bought by 3.2% per year. Now remember what the goal is here. The goal is you want to buy low and sell high, right? So anything you sell, you would expect it wouldn't do as well, and anything you buy, you want it to do better than the average. And yet, the opposite is true. So that tells us we do not do well as individuals when it comes to investing. How about the experts? Well, in this case, the experts actually do better. The reason the experts do better is they're able to factor out some of those emotions and it doesn't enter into their trades as much. However, in different studies that are done, between 70 and 80% still underperform the market or the average. This is mainly because of trading costs. But I can also tell you that top experts using algorithms with high-performance computing have also failed. And probably the most notable example of this is long-term capital management, Long-term capital management, if you don't know, had one very experienced trader and 2 Nobel laureates. They failed within a few years. They made money in the beginning and then they failed. So how about using AI? Well, so it just so happens there was a recent article that was, well, it's not published yet, that examines the impact of using machine learning with decision trees and neural nets to predict stock prices. So this is what the authors conclude. Machine learning offers an improved description of asset price behavior relative to traditional methods. In other words, it does a better job predicting than we do. However, there's a big caveat to this. And the caveat is that this only holds for large stocks where there's a lot of information available about them. For small stocks, it doesn't hold. So, what about humans versus machine? Well, we've been leading up to this. And to summarize that, we can say humans have biases that affect their decisions in predictable ways. Machines can improve results. It's not guaranteed, but they can. Because they're able to avoid some of those common human biases, and we can make sure through analysis that we leave those predictable biases out of the algorithms that we're using. Does that mean AI is free from bias? Well, you'll have to answer this yourself, but I can tell you the questions that I ask. Are the assumptions we're using in the program and the model free from bias? Is the model's framework free from bias? Is the data free from bias? And do the programs ignore all human biases? And it's reasonable to note, the algorithms and the models come from humans. So can we really factor that all out? I think it's worth asking. I should add, I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day who works at our advanced photon source, and he was showing me some data that he had gotten off the beamline. And he actually discovered something pretty interesting that I'll talk about in a little bit. What they found was that there was a consistent bias in the data that they were getting off the APS. They weren't sure what it was causing it, but it was pretty interesting, and they could predict it. So even the data can have issues. So I'll use another example from finance now that affects everyone in this room. Well, most of you in this room, I'll say. Okay? And what we're going to do is talk about estimating the future value of a stream of payments. What does that have to do with most of the people in this room? Well, it affects everyone with a defined contribution or a defined benefit retirement plan. Huh? Well, if you have an IRA, a 401k, or a 403b, this affects you. Because one of the things you want to know is, how much money will I have when I retire? And how much do I need to contribute now? It turns out this is a pretty complex problem, where the answer has significant impact on even how well you might be able to eat in retirement. Most models do this by starting in looking at data for past returns and extrapolating forward. But which data is best as a basis for modeling? We have data for returns going back to 1871. Do we start there? Well, it turns out the accuracy and consistency of the data can change in different time periods for many different reasons. And some of those are the measurement methods change. This happens in science too, right? Also, how we measure, the indices we use, the averages, change over time. Different companies, some go out of business, some come into being, and they get added and dropped from the index. And there are other factors too that we can talk about. The economy overall can be a factor. So it turns out the predictions change significantly depending on the data selected as a basis for the estimates. And as a result, average returns and variations for returns can differ markedly. The different periods are influenced by many factors, including the starting and ending points of the data set that we use to set things up, relative to business cycles, and relative asset prices at that time. And what outcomes are possible? Well, using different historic data as the basis for modeling the future can show significantly different retirement savings outcomes, like hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars, depending on the time period selected in terms of the predictions. And this isn't for people at the high end of the income game either. This is for average workers, average salaries. Okay, and not contributing huge amounts. This assumes 8%. And that would include the matching that you would get from your firm. So this makes me feel little. Because it's a difficult question. And when people ask me this, and my field's finance, it's very hard for me to tell you that I have a definitive answer. I don't. So can AI help? Well, it can operate without emotions or biases born from fear, greed, or over-optimism. And as you know better than I do, AI can analyze a lot of data. It can look for correlations, test fits of data between time periods, assign probabilities, use simulations, adjust as new data becomes available, and more. But the starting point of the data for the past returns can still introduce bias. Fundamental changes in the economy can occur where the past is also not a good indicator of the future, which means that past data set isn't even going to be useful. And of course, that's why you see all the disclaimers, right, with the investment companies, and they say, future results may not mirror past returns. And unfortunately, there can also be trends that are not yet recognized or easily predicted. We might have technological changes that will make things really different and make those returns really different from what we've seen in the past. There could be a devastating war or something else. There can also be what we call black swan events, which you may know this, but the term black swan events was coined because at one time people believed there could never be a black swan. There were people in Europe who had only seen white swans. And until anyone went to Australia, they didn't realize a black swan could exist. So these are things that we can't even imagine could be possible, part of our humanness. And I'm not sure AI can pick that up either. Another thing that we talk about in economics that's very difficult is what we call non-events. And non-events have to do with what we call opportunity costs, and that is, what have you given up to do something else? It means you have to think about things you've never done or will never do, and what the value of that is relative to what you did. That's pretty hard. And as I said before, the data itself can introduce bias. We haven't talked about this, but I'll just mention what I call quantitative bias. And so one thing that can happen is quantitatively, the ability to measure returns can change over time, and just that ability to measure, the accuracy of those measurements can skew results over time. We can also have spurious correlations. If we have lots and lots of data, we would expect that there are going to be variables that look like they vary with one another, but there's no reason for it, and they won't continue. How do we distinguish that? To me, it's also interesting that we tend to focus on measurable variables. Why? Because it's easy. Qualitative variables are really hard. And how do we put them into a model? So all of this can impact all analysis, including AI. So for me, I like to ask the following question. Can quantitative measures tell me which picture is more beautiful? As I said before, I'm good at asking questions. I can't answer this. However, there's extra credit if you can answer it for me. So what does it all mean? The general modeling and data issues described are not unique. They're applicable to natural science and other applications as well as finance. And what conclusions can I possibly have? Well, there are many advantages of AI. The ability to analyze more data more accurately and more efficiently certainly is an advantage. And we can use it to minimize our own biases in implementing models and forecasts because we're not as prone to optimism bias, status quo bias, et cetera, using AI. But maybe there are some shortcomings too. Fundamental structural changes in what's underlying, like the economy, may not be captured well by models. We might think of this as what are called scientific revolutions, revolutions in scientific thought, where we have a complete change. An example would be, at one time we went from thinking the Earth was flat to the Earth was not flat. Or the universe revolved around the Earth, and then it didn't, right? But also there can be constraints within just the mechanism of using the algorithms and biases contained within that. So, wow. So that doesn't help us, does it? Well, what should I do? Well, I'll go back to our opening question. Is artificial intelligence as intelligent as it thinks it is? Well, maybe that's a biased question. Maybe I didn't ask the right question. Maybe I should be asking, is artificial intelligence as intelligent as humans think it is? In that case, I'm pretty certain I conclude it is not. Simply because it's far from perfect, because of the human element. We write the algorithms upon which AI is based, and we're susceptible to biases for the methods we create, including AI. So that brings us to sunset here. But I would like to give a special thank you to the following people. I thank all of these people for helping me to think about and refine tonight's presentation. But I want you to know you cannot blame them for the biases and shortcomings contained within it. Those are mine alone. So we'll end with a very pretty picture from the Hubble Space Telescope. Actually, we will have two of these. And my acknowledgements. I thank Argonne National Laboratory, the Department of Energy,